So there's my thumbs up. And we are recording, so I'm going to say good morning again, and it looks like we're coming up on numbers pretty nicely. I'm looking at what's happening with the virus, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes in terms of some of the national and political implications. But one of the things, being a New Yorker, that I'm particularly focused on right now. It always sounds strange to me to say I'm a New Yorker when talking to California people. I'm of course a Californian as well, but living in New York, the fact that stealth transmission combined with inadequate and delayed testing means we often don't know for a week or 2 weeks until after it's spreading where the virus is spreading. And so all that to say, this is a situation that requires vigilance. And I know it's costly. I know it's hard to be not seeing the people you want to see, not doing the things you want to do, not leading the life you want to lead. I'm getting ready to inaugurate a new class of first-year students into Sarah Lawrence College, and it's going to be under very different circumstances than any of us had anticipated. But we've got to, both for our own sakes and for the sake of the well-being of our fellow citizens, do everything in our power to keep this virus under control. So I probably don't need to be saying this to all of you, but I do hope you will remain safe and vigilant. So I'm going to do something a little bit different today, as I've indicated last week. I know that there is some impatience to be talking about politics. And obviously, we are in I guess I can say in the midst. It certainly doesn't really feel like we're in the midst of a national election, but we are in the middle of a national election, and it has to be one of the most bizarre national elections, unprecedented national elections, I think, in any of our lifetimes. I've been following electoral politics closely since the early 1980s, and I've never seen anything like this. And as we mentioned, we've got the intersection of three really very peculiar historical trends all occurring at the same time. A once a century pandemic, a once every 50 to 75 year recession, and a once every couple generation wave of protest politics, all of that occurring at the same time. And in a climate in which our public sphere has been rapidly transformed by new media, new forms of communication that have we haven't had time to develop either cultural norms or individual resources or public policy to regulate and figure out how to accommodate the transformation of the way in which information is transmitted. And obviously that's imperative to democracy. And so this was already perilous political times for a democracy, especially given the degree of polarization in the United States and the potential for outside interference. And then we add to all of that a pandemic, a steep recession, and protest politics erupting in our streets. And by the way, obviously those three current confluent trends are not independent from each other, right? I don't think we would be having the protests if we didn't have the degree of unemployment that we have right now. I don't think we would have the degree of unemployment that we have right now if we didn't have the pandemic. So we've got kind of, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but a set of circumstances that is completely displacing all of the normal expectations around a national election. And I do want to speak with you a little bit about that. And so how I'm going to depart from normal today is I am going to start the lecture by giving you a little bit of a political update. I've been hoping to rush through the material on inequality so as to be really able to transition into contemporary politics. But I think it's better just to take a pause and talk about contemporary politics for a little while. And so that's what I'm going to do. I want to be clear about one more thing, and that is that my motivation for doing a lecture series on inequality, which has taken us a long time, taken me a long time to give you the full range of information I thought would be relevant, was in part that it didn't feel right to just be looking at the car wreck of the news of the day with you, that it made sense to pull back from that and to be able to think together about something else. But it's also the case, it seems to me, that if we're looking for an explanation for why the coronavirus has hit the United States so hard, and like I say, I'll give you more information on that in a moment, a large part of that has to do with the current administration in Washington, D.C. And if we want to understand why we elected a man with absolutely no experience in government to the highest office in the land, we've got to look at rising inequality. And so the lecture series was an effort to kind of pull back from the depressing details of the everyday news. I still want to do that with you, but I also, in order to provide you some context for understanding what's happening, but I also recognize that we're hungry for a little political discussion together, and I'm happy to accommodate that. So where we left off last week and where we'll resume this week was talking about Scanlon's framework for analysis on why inequality matters, and I will conclude that discussion today. And I do want to give the first in probably a couple lectures on policy approaches, which is, we looked a little bit at that last week as well. But before doing that, I'm going to give you an overview of what's happening in our national elections. And so to start things out, we have clear nominees from both parties, as you're well aware: Joe Biden for the Democrats, Donald Trump for the Republicans. And this is a long-term, and let me explain this, some of you have heard me explain this before, polling average for the two candidates. And so to be clear, you can see lots of little light blue and lots of little light red dots on this map. Each of those is an individual poll. And if you were to do it carefully, they're all paired with each other, right? So those are actually two data points, one for Biden, one for Trump, and an individual poll. This is 538, which is the website I prefer. You could get this on Politico.com or other places as well. I believe the New York Times will start doing something like this pretty soon too. But 538 does a couple things I like. Well, one of them is to average all these polls. So instead of looking at an individual poll, which may have some difficulties with it or some anomalies or may just reflect what's happening in that moment the poll was conducted, if you average a whole bunch of polls, you get a better sense of hopefully evening out the flaws in data collection for any one poll. Second of all, the 538 average doesn't just average the polls, it also weights them according to the quality of the poll. Some of that has to do with the poll's methodology, some of it has to do with the poll's track record. All that to say, polling is an art, not a science. Polling is a snapshot, not a prediction. Polling has famously misled us, including in 2016, although I would point out that 538 did a fair bit better than many other polls in indicating that there was some probability that Hillary Clinton could win the popular vote but lose the electoral college vote. But polls don't tell us what's going to happen 90 or 100 days from now. We're about 100 days from the election. That's a few eternities in political time. Having given you all the qualifications and the provisos, now let's look at what's actually happening. And part of what you can see is that Donald Trump entered the coronavirus period with about 45% of the American people indicating that they supported him, maybe 46, maybe 47, depending on the moment. And after getting a little bit of a bump, a so-called rally around the flag phenomena in mid-April, his support has actually pretty consistently declined into the low 40s, right? And in electoral politics, moving from the mid to high 40s to the low 40s is significant. And at the same time, Joe Biden has been quite steady in his level of support. If you look at where he was in March of 2020 and where he is in late July of 2020, it's almost identical. And so there've been, right, that rally around the flag moment drew some of Biden's support to Trump, but Biden has been quite strong and consistent in drawing around 50% of the American people's support. The real variable here has been Trump. Trump has moved down, and the stability of these numbers, I think, is also striking. If I were to give you a longer term approval rating for Trump, and let me do that, or let me try to, oh, maybe I don't, here I have it. No, I'm sorry. Yes, okay, I'm sorry, here I have it. What you would see is that Trump's popularity or unpopularity, those who approve of him and those who disapprove of him, has been quite variable, right? It stayed in a band for most of his presidency, with his approval rating at best getting into the high 40s, his disapproval rating at worst getting into the high 50s. But it does vary. It's not as stable as what we're seeing in the other diagram. And so returning to the other diagram for a moment, then what I want to point out to you is that this race is reflecting a pattern. And that pattern is that Donald Trump does not have the support that he had in 2016, and that Joe Biden is consistently 3 or 4 percentage points better in terms of support than Hillary Clinton was in 2016. And so unless something upsets this pattern, this certainly appears to be a recipe for a Biden victory. As I say, I issued all those provisos. I'm not predicting that. I'm just showing you what the data shows and then what we should anticipate. Of course, national elections are not decided by the outcome of the national popular vote. They're decided by the Electoral College. That's why 538 is called 538. It's a website named after the number of Electoral College votes there are, right? And since there are 538, you need 270 to win. And what this map shows, and in a sense, this is the more illuminating map, it seems to me, is that right now, it appears that Joe Biden essentially would have to completely collapse to lose states that he has 185 electoral college votes in. Donald Trump would have to completely collapse in order to lose states where he currently has 125 electoral college votes. Joe Biden appears to have another 53 electoral college votes in states like Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota, and Michigan, where he's polling quite well. But it's not quite as solid, and some of those states have gone the other direction in recent elections. And Donald Trump has 61 states leaning in his direction, or 61 electoral college votes leaning in his direction from 3 states: Georgia, Texas, and Iowa, right? And so that gives you more of a sense of why uh, right now Biden is ahead in the electoral college math, right? He's up to, it appears to be, around 240, the 270 he needs, and then also a sense of where the action is going to be. It's going to be in Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, right? Those are the toss-up states. And as those of you who are following this know, Biden is actually doing quite well in Arizona, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, in terms of his current polling. And that reflects then the fact that he's doing quite well nationally, and so he's overcoming some of the impediments to his winning these swing states. One more way to look at this, and I'm just kind of setting things up so we've got this all in mind when we do this together in the future. And in a sense, I'm sorry, I know this doesn't really look like the United States, but I think in a sense this is the most illuminating way to look at that map. You've got states like Wyoming, for instance, or Montana, that take up a lot of territory on the map, but as it turns out, right, they only have 2 senators and 1 member of Congress, so they only get 3 electoral college votes. And then you have states like Massachusetts that don't take up a lot of territory on the map, but actually have 3 or 4 times the electoral power, right? And so this is a map that weights the states by electoral power. And as you can see, most of the states that lean red are smaller. And many of the biggest states lean blue. The places where the large states favor Trump or are up in the air, places like Texas, Georgia, Florida, are the places where I think this election will really be decided. And so that's just to give you a bit more of a breakdown when we talk about Biden having a substantial lead in the overall polling for the nation. What we really need to look at is how is Biden doing in Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, right? This is the unfortunate, to my mind, nature of American politics, because what a presidential candidate does to win Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin is not necessarily what the country needs him to do. And so we end up giving disproportionate attention to swing states and catering our politics to them. But that is the way, given the Electoral College, American politics works right now. And so that's where the action is in this election. Now, in addition to this being a presidential election, it's obviously also congressional elections taking place. All of the House of Representatives and a little bit more than a third of the Senate will be decided in 2020. And as you can see, again, this is a national poll, not a state-by-state poll. And so this is a little misleading. But the Democrats are clearly way ahead in the race, generally speaking, for Congress. This is called the generic ballot. And what this means is you just poll people and you say, if you were to vote today, would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat? And as you can see, there's a more than 8 percentage point lead for the Democrats. That would amount to, if that holds through November, and probably it won't, right? The trend in American politics is that people come home to their party, that partisan identity tends to be quite stable. And so we shouldn't anticipate that although there are a number of very important headwinds for the Republicans, that they're going to stay as low as they are right now. But if they did, and in light of this data, I think we are correct to anticipate a so-called blue wave election, the second in a row. And you may have seen a lot of the members of the Republican donor class are reporting that they're shifting their attention from supporting Donald Trump to supporting embattled Republicans in the Senate. And they're doing that because they believe that given the current dynamics, the Democrats are going to hold the House and probably win the presidency. And this is no guarantee. And I don't want to be in the business of giving you odds in a horse race, right? But if you're just looking at the numbers, that's what looks like is going to happen right now. And so that the best chance that the Republicans have for holding on to power in one of our main policy-making institutions is the Senate. And so Republican donors, the big donors, are starting to redirect their funding away from Donald Trump and into the endangered Republican Senate candidates. And that reflects the fact that they too are anticipating that this may be a so-called blue wave election. Now, when we look at which seats are in play in the Senate, again, just to kind of set up the framework for subsequent analysis, what we can see is that the Republicans have to defend more seats in 2020 than the Republicans do. I'm sorry, the Republicans have to defend more seats than the Democrats do. And you can see this state by state, but they are defending them in states that are generally quite Republican to begin with. And when we talked about this a year or 2 years ago, most people actually thought that this was a Senate map that favored the Republicans. And part of what has changed in the last year is that more Republicans in traditionally Republican-leaning states appear to be in some danger. The polls are showing very tight races in 8 out of these 23 elections where Republicans are defending. 2 out of the 12 Democrats are also in competitive races, especially in Alabama, where there's a good likelihood that the Democrat will lose. It's a quite red state. But all that to say, like I say, a year, 2 years ago, most people who looked at this thought that it was almost certainly the case that the Republicans would retain control of the Senate. I think many people think now that it's certainly possible that the Democrats will retain control of the Senate. And I actually read a story just the other day about whether or not the Democrats could gain 60 seats, a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. People think that's very unlikely. They'd have to do things like win in Texas or Kentucky. But there are some polls showing that that's not as impossible as it would have appeared just a year ago. So if everything I've told you is correct, and please note, I'm not predicting what's going to happen in November. I'm just analyzing what the data says is happening right now. It appears that there may be real danger for the Republicans at the national level in 2020. And I want to ask why that is. And here I'm going to start with some grim data. This is the data about the coronavirus, right? And I'll get into this more in a minute. But this is data that looks at state by state, right? And so it compares it with some of the worst countries in the world, Oman and Bahrain, Panama and South Africa. By the way, the United States is on that list of the worst countries in the world. And what you can see is that there are 10 states that, if they were countries, all of them would be the worst country in the world, right? So our states, 10 of our states are doing worse than the rest of the world at managing the coronavirus, even places with much less developed governmental structures and public health infrastructure. Why is that? It gets complicated very quickly. But I do think that one thing that is hard to escape is that all of these states are led by Republican governors. I believe I have that accurate. I didn't actually go back and check state by state, but it does seem to me that that is the case. And if you think about kind of the core function of government, keep your citizens alive, fed, safe, keep their property intact. And it appears that a substantial number of Republican governors are failing that core function right now. And of course, we have states like Georgia, where the governor is actually deeply at odds with even the mayors of major cities in Georgia about mandating mask wearing, et cetera. And so if among the things that happened in 2020 is that political leaders get punished for mismanaging the virus, I do think that there's likely to be a partisan dimension to that. It's not going to be a plague on both your houses so much as it's going to land more on the door of the Republican Party. And so when we think then about why the Republicans are so far behind, and I showed you this a little while ago, we're in an era in which, if you remember Tip O'Neill saying all politics is local, in a sense, the opposite is the case now, which is to say all politics are national. And in saying that, what has been the case for at least the last decade is that there are very few ticket splitters. People vote for the president and the Senate and the Congress and state officials and local officials more or less along a party line. And so if the top of the ticket, if the presidential standard bearer is unpopular, it drags down the entire ticket. And as we can see, Donald Trump has an unpopularity rating, a net approval rating of -15. That is to say, 15% of 15% more people disapprove than approve of him, 55% to 40%. That's a disapproval rating that no incumbent has ever gotten reelected with. And it does appear to be dragging down the rest of the Republican ticket as well. So then the next question is, what's dragging down Trump's disapproval rating? And I think the answer is quite apparent. It's the coronavirus in the first instance. And I just wanted to show you this data. This is today's New York Times, a couple diagrams. One of them shows that if we look at the worst countries, we're now looking at large, relatively wealthy countries. If we look at the countries that did the worst or were hardest hit by the coronavirus, Italy, Spain, Britain, Sweden, right, and the United States, all of the other countries have succeeded at a proportionate level of bringing their new cases under control, right? Spain is seeing a bit of a resurgence, and you may have seen that today the European Union actually banned internal travel from Spain. The United States is simply off the charts in a totally different category in terms of not having contained, but in fact now in many respects doubling the per capita average for cases in the earlier phases of the virus. And similarly, now if we compare ourselves with the countries that have done better at controlling it as opposed to the countries that have done worse, we really are failing to mitigate the human impact of this pandemic. And obviously, Donald Trump is in the middle of what appears to be a half-hearted pivot on this issue, beginning to advise mask wearing and to be a little bit less head in the sands about what is going to happen to the country in the foreseeable future, the next month or two. But I don't think that changes the verdict on his management of the first 5 months of the virus. And I will just point out to you, I should have pointed this out to you when I was looking at this data. When we look at the past of presidential elections, one of the things we see, and in many respects, again, I think this should give us pause about how public opinion works, is that presidential, when an incumbent is standing for re-election, in presidential politics, they tend to get credit or blame for how the country is doing in roughly the 6 to 9 months before the election. And most people make up their minds about how a president is doing in the summer before the election. And so we see, right, Donald Trump's approval rating has gone down for him at the very worst possible time in terms of his prospects for re-election. And there are, exceptions to this generalization. Harry Truman, for instance, managed to come back from negative approval ratings in the summer before his re-election, but it's very unusual. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that given that things are bad now and have been bad for several months, that it's going to be very hard for Donald Trump to shake responsibility for the way in which the country has mismanaged the response to the coronavirus and the tremendous human cost of that mismanagement. And so I think, and again, this is just to tell you what I'm seeing in terms of looking at the dynamics in this race right now. Trump and his team understand that there's only one way they're going to win this election, and that is by dragging Joe Biden's numbers down. And frankly, that is the way in which Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. But one of the things that is true of Clinton is that she had high pre-existing negatives, that there were a lot of people who disliked her, and that even the people who liked her had some reservations about her. Joe Biden does not seem to have those liabilities, whether that's fair or not. I'm not evaluating at this point, I'm merely describing, but it is going to be more difficult for Trump to pull Biden down far enough for him to have the possibility of gaining re-election. I think it's also clear now, give me one moment, what his strategy, what Trump's strategy will be to try to do this. And it's a somewhat complicated strategy. He has concluded that most voters do not believe that Joe Biden is a radical leftist, or that Joe Biden would mismanage the coronavirus or the economy. In that sense, the what he has to work with is difficult. By the way, I wanted to point out to you the other thing that's dragging Donald Trump down. I just mentioned the economy, is obviously that the coronavirus has upended the American economy. We went from actually having the longest sustained growth period on record and beginning to see some movement finally on wages as a result of low unemployment. And so things were looking really quite good through the beginning of 2020. This is the unemployment filings. And I'm going to concentrate there for a moment. As you can see, beginning in March of 2020, our unemployment filings went through the roof. To be clear, going back to 1950, there had never been a week in which there were new filings of more than 1 million. And in March, we had successive weeks in which there were more than 3 million, and then 6+ million, and 6+ million, and 5+ million. We're in completely unprecedented territory in terms of the level of unemployment. And one of the things that is happening now, as I don't think it's accurate to say we're having a double dip recession. I think what's much more accurate to say is that we're in the midst of one of the most powerful economic contractions in American history, right? You know, the only comparison really in the 20th century is the Great Depression. And there was some hope that maybe it would be short-lived. It would be a so-called V recession, in which it goes down sharply but comes back up sharply. What we're beginning to see now, right? And so we did see these unemployment filings come down in April, but then they stopped going down in June. And now they've actually come back up, the most recent filing, which came on Thursday, or the most recent data report. And so it appears that this is going to be a longer term recession. And what's especially important, I think, is that if you look at the categories that people are filing under, temporary job loss filings are going down. Permanent job loss filings are going up. And so what that means is that as opposed to people being laid off or furloughed, now the companies that they're working for are either themselves folding, or else they're saying, we can no longer afford, if we furloughed you, often we're paying your health care. We can't afford to do that anymore. We are not just saying don't come to work until we tell you to come back. We're saying you no longer have a job, right? And so the economic wreckage that is following the pandemic and our failure to manage it is beginning to appear to be quite long lasting. And this is obviously also dragging Donald Trump down. I'll say one more thing about this before returning to Joe Biden. I haven't lost track of that. And that is that the US federal government, Congress, did something to assist with this, which was to expand quite dramatically unemployment benefits, right? $600 a week, as you've probably been hearing about. And so this diagram, also from the New York Times, I think is very useful. And let me explain it to you. The bottom row of white dots show what unemployment benefits would be without the added $600 supplement, right? And this is by income group. So if you're making $20,000 a year, your usual unemployment benefit would be around $200 a week, right? That went up by $600 to $800 a week, right? And so as opposed to, and to be clear, what this diagram also shows is that would have been, if you look at the band, 40% to 60% of the income. So it replaces part of your income. Whereas with the $600 supplement, right, which was not indexed to your previous income, you actually are making more than 100% of the income you lost, considerably more if you were a low wage worker, right? It's only when you get up to people who are making around $50,000 a year or more that unemployment benefits just replace what you were earning. And if you're making $60,000 a year or more, they don't even replace what you were earning, right? But so, right, this is to get at the value of this $600 addition. It has in many ways really prevented the bottom from falling out of consumer spending in the United States. But it expires. It actually just expired, though it'll be paid through the end of the month. And if it isn't replaced, we go back to these levels, right? Yeah, there is a Republican proposal to replace it by 70% of your income. And as you can see, what that does is make it marginally better than what the old unemployment benefit would have been for most low-income workers, but quite a bit better for high-income workers. Not as good as the $600 plus, until you get up to people making around $80,000 a year. And then the Republican proposal is actually better for them. But as you've probably seen, Nancy Pelosi rejected this proposal. And it seems to me one of the things we're seeing is that the Democrats are favoring a proposal, continuing the $600 benefit, that is clearly good for the majority of American workers, the people who are making less than $80,000. And the Republicans have put themselves in a position where they again appear to be favoring high-income workers. Having said all that, I think there's a real policy dispute here, which is that the people who all of a sudden are making half again as much or twice as much as they would be making if they were employed, that doesn't give them much incentive to go back to work. That might be a real problem if the economy started to hum again. Seems to me to be less of a problem in the current moment. So, going back to Joe Biden now. Donald Trump has concluded that the only way he can pull this election out, the people who are running his campaign have concluded that the only way they can pull this election out is by dragging Joe Biden down. Go back to, right, just the basic comparison between them in terms of how they're polling. And what you see is Biden is up above 50%. Trump is down at 42%. That's not a way to win an election. Trump doesn't think he can improve his numbers. He's got to pull Biden down. But the problem is people don't think Biden will be bad at managing the virus or bad at managing the economy. How then do you damage Biden? And what we're seeing is the emergence of a clear strategy. We'll see if it works or not, which is to associate Biden himself may not be a radical, but we've got a problem, or really a twofold problem in this country. And here I'm giving you Trump's line. This is not David Peritz's analysis. This is what Donald Trump wants you to believe. The twofold problem is, first of all, that the country is in trouble in terms of law and order. Between the pandemic, the growth in unemployment, and the Black Lives Matters protests, we've got rising forces of agitation, anarchists, Antifa radicals in our streets, right? And they are coming for our monuments, but they're also coming for our property and our laws, right? And then the second dimension to this is, and Joe Biden has sold out, right? He is totally beholden to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the far left of the Democratic Party because he needs their votes. Now, we'll get into this in a minute. This is in part relevant to Biden's vice presidential pick. I suspect Joe Biden is not going to pick a leftist vice presidential candidate. He's going to pick another mainstream, middle of the road, somewhat conservative Democrat like himself. We'll have to see. I don't know who it will be. I don't have a crystal ball. But it seems to me that Biden can do the electoral math that I'm doing. And the electoral math says that if we look, I'm sorry, let me jump back to a slightly different diagram here now. If we look at the electoral map, right, where do the people who support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and those kinds of politicians live? Guess what? They live in the dark blue states. They live in the places that Biden's going to win. You know, if he's got any chance of winning the presidency, he's going to win those places. He doesn't need their votes, right? Where he needs to compete is in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arizona. And so he needs a VP that's going to help him there. And so I suspect he's going to pick a moderate vice presidential candidate, which is going to make it all the harder for Trump to say, if Joe Biden is elected, you're really electing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Elizabeth Warren. They're going to pull the strings. And if Joe Biden is elected and controlled by the radical left of the Democratic Party, they're going to defund the police. And they're going to encourage the Black Lives Matter protesters and the other radicals and the anarchists. And the whole country is going to be unsafe. I think that's what we're seeing as the emerging strategy from Donald Trump. The emerging strategy from Joe Biden is a little bit more difficult to discern because it seems to be primarily allow Trump to continue to damage himself, allow him to continue to mismanage, let him draw all the attention. In a sense, this is how Trump got elected. He's very good at monopolizing the spotlight of the public sphere. But when he does that and all the news is bad, then guess what? It's not to his advantage. And so Biden's strategy so far seems to be get out of the way and let Trump damage himself. I suspect that is going to change. It will probably change beginning with Biden's VP pick and then the nominating convention, which of course will be an entirely virtual convention, and then ramping up of his media presence. By the way, I'll just add, one of the things I think that we pay attention to is how the fundraising race is going. And Donald Trump had a sizable advantage because he was the clear nominee of his party all the way back in 2017 when he started his fundraising campaign for re-election. Joe Biden is quickly closing the gap, and so appears to be in a position to mount a full-throated presidential campaign. And so we probably will be hearing more from him on policy as well as how he's going to try to define himself. I've spoken for a long time. Obviously, there was a lot to cover there. Let me stop and take your questions. And so get ready. I'm going to unmute everyone, turn your radios or whatever you have on in the background down, and then whoever wants to ask a question, go ahead.
Hi, David.
Hi, who am I? Is this Matt or who am I speaking with?
Don Campbell.
So I've got a serious echo. Go ahead. Who was talking?
I was for one.
John Campbell, go ahead.
Okay. It leaves out what seems to be the most apparent now. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right, of course, but his main tack right now seems to be calling Biden, not an economic, but a left-wing extremist who's in favor of riots in the streets and confusing, the violent demonstrations with peaceful demonstrations and sending these stormtroopers in to bang people on the head and all. A lot of commentators seem to find it really frightening, and I must say, I do too. It's the closest thing to a, you could say, authoritarian or even fascist kind of pattern that we've seen so far, and we've seen quite a few.
Yeah, and there's an American journalist who refers to this as performative fascism. I don't know if you've seen that label. So right, Trump has limited instruments at his disposal right now. Among them are the Department of Homeland Security troops, which he's employing in a way that I think nobody anticipated that they would be deployed, and to do things that are clearly making things worse. And, forgive me, I'm now no longer a political analyst. I'm somebody who's speaking from my conviction, doing so not for the sake of protecting federal property, et cetera, but simply for the sake of trying to create a news feed on Fox that says anarchy is already in our streets. Look, we've got to use tear gas. We've got to use batons. And by the way, look at the big, strong men I'm unleashing on those unruly protesters. I am the candidate of order and authority. Yes, I completely agree with you, John. It's funny. I thought you were going to say something else, which is that the other line of attack is going to be that Joe Biden is mentally incompetent, right? That he's starting to decline. He's no longer sharp. He's no longer energetic. He misspeaks all the time, and he's going to be confused and incompetent. I suspect that they're going to try that line of attack too. I suspect that's going to be an uphill battle, simply because Trump doesn't appear to be particularly with it himself a fair bit of the time. And frankly, maybe we should wish that Donald Trump was a little bit less energetic than he is. That might not be a bad thing. But yes, John, I absolutely agree with you. It's not just that Trump is starting to mount a campaign strategy. He's doing things with policy to make that campaign strategy appear credible. And I do watch Fox News almost every night. I hope you'll give me some points for that, because it's not easy to do, but I do think it's important to do. And what you see on Fox News is a very different image of America. And it is one in which law and order is slipping away, and Portland demonstrates that, right? And so that, unfortunately, it appears that federal troops will be coming to more cities. One of the questions will be, can those who want to resist them figure out an adequate legal strategy to do so? The inspector generals will be investigating this, but I suspect that will take time. The mayor of Portland didn't have standing. So who wants to ask the next question? John, do you want to follow up or?
Yeah, I did want to mention that regarding the mental capacity question, Borowitz's headline today is that, let me get it here. Obama passes cognitive test by reciting first 50 digits of pi.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Whatever it was, camera, man, woman. It could be a little bit trickier than that. Who else wants to ask a question at this point?
Flossie.
Yeah, go ahead, Flossie.
I'm thinking going back to the 60s, the flower children, if Trump brings on his troopers, if we could organize ladies in wheelchairs, people on canes, kids offering the troopers flowers and bubbles and balloons. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it worked in the 60s. So I want to recommend that. I also think that concerning Biden's supposed fragility, it makes the vice presidential candidate very important. Whether it's a he or a she, she's got to be presidential material. She's got to have the stuff of being able to step in and take over. And I'm not sure. John Campbell recommended that we read an article on the possibility that Susan Rice might be the right person rather than Elizabeth Warren, which I don't think he's accepted her, but maybe Stacey Abrams. She might be a little bit too much, although she'd be strong. But somebody seemingly as bland now as Susan Rice, does that strike you as having any possibility?
Well, so here I've got to say that I find myself in complete agreement with John. And I'm not gaming this. I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about this, but Susan Rice is the person who I've been thinking might have the best chance. And for two reasons. Obviously, she checks the box. She's an African-American woman, but also because she's not encumbered by domestic political considerations, right? She's not had to define herself carefully on things to do with police reform or criminal justice reform or other more contentious issues. And at the same time, she has very strong credentials for foreign policy. And that might be also attractive when we're in the middle of a global pandemic and seem to be starting a Cold War with China. And so, yeah, I happen to independently have come to the conclusion that Susan Rice might have a really strong profile for becoming vice president. I, like you, would prefer someone who might be an engine for domestic policy initiatives, somebody like Elizabeth Warren. It seems to me that, frankly, we don't get ourselves out of the mess that got us to where we are now without really aggressive domestic policy initiatives. But this is the wisdom of democratic politics and the so-called wisdom of the multitude. Maybe the most important thing to do in 2020 is to make sure we don't have 4 more years of Donald Trump. And that in a sense, the Democratic electorate in the primaries picked a candidate best poised to do that because he's the candidate who Donald Trump is least able to demonize. And maybe Susan Rice also fits that bill, and that they just don't want to give Donald Trump anything to hit. So he keeps flailing and the attention remains on him. So yeah, see, all that to say, like I said, I'm not doing this. I'm not going through all the details of the biographies of all the possible candidates. But Susan Rice, who I went to graduate school with, I know personally, I do think highly of her, and I do also think that she's likely to be in serious competition for the vice presidential.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And anyone else? First chance to talk domestic politics and with me for quite a while. Anybody have another comment or anything else they want to discuss?
Yeah, I have a comment for you. This is Matt.
Yeah, I can hear your voice, Matt. Go ahead. I don't see your picture yet, but I recognize the voice. There you are.
Okay, yeah. I think Tammy Duckworth has to be the vice presidential candidate. I mean, who else could come up with the appropriate name for the president? Cadet Bone Spurs.
All right. So you want somebody who has the same schoolyard bully proclivities as Donald Trump, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is to play against Joe Biden, who is so nice, but we need a vice president who can handle the other side of it.
Yeah, interesting. So, and obviously Tammy Duckworth brings some of the same strength that Rice brings, it seems to me, in terms of having very solid foreign policy credentials, being an expat, having proved her patriotism with sacrifice. I don't know. She doesn't check one of the other boxes, but let's hope it doesn't just come down to checking identity boxes. All right, so I managed to spend the whole hour talking domestic politics with you. That's okay. And like I say, I'm going to finish up the inequality stuff soon, and I hope the stuff that I have to do with you next week will be the stuff that you consider to be, in a sense, the most interesting. What should we do? What policy options are available to us? And I'll start talking about the low-lying fruit, the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that we can do easily, and then also the more ambitious stuff. And when I get to the more ambitious stuff, we'll have to have another conversation about Biden, assuming that Biden wins, that the Democrats actually gain control of the Senate. What should they do legislatively, assuming they can actually legislate? And I that's a really important conversation to be having. And in a sense, the first thing to be thinking about is what they could be doing to address inequality in the United States. Obviously, get the pandemic under control and unemployment benefits back to where they need to be. All right, everybody, please continue to be safe, be vigilant, and I will see you all next Saturday morning. Take care. Thank you.
That's the end of it.
Bye, everybody.
Can you talk about any